The sun pressed down like a sentence passed. The dry earth cracked beneath the weight of the light, and nothing moved but dust. Even the wind had given up only. The low hum of flies lingered over the carcass of silence. Jack Miles stood at the edge of his corral, hat in hand, staring at the hole in the ground where his horse now lay. He'd dug it himself. Took him all morning, through the pain and the shaking and the sweat that soaked through his shirt like guilt. The horse's name was Dolly. She'd been with him longer than anyone, longer than his wife, longer than the hired hands who used to come and go, drawn in by the myth of a kind rancher and a square meal. She was the last moving thing on the ranch besides Jack, and now she was still too. Jack let the hat fall back onto his head. His leg pulsed, dull and mean, a tumor wrapped around the bone like a vine. The doctor in town had told him what it was, in words to clean for what it did. He'd nodded, declined the papers, and walked out. That had been 2 winters ago. He'd made it this far without help. Maybe that was something to be proud of. Maybe not. He limped back toward the porch, every step driving a nail deeper into his thigh. The boards creaked under his weight. The house looked like a man exhaling, sagging at the corners, windows like tired eyes. He sat on the old bench that used to hold two. Now it only needed to hold one. Beyond the fence, the land stretched out in all directions, flat and unforgiving, mesquite, greasewood, and cactus. The kind of land that didn't forgive mistakes or wait for miracles. A hawk circled above, riding the heat. Jack squinted up at it and then looked away. He wasn't ready to be taken yet. Not quite. Inside, the house was quiet. The kind of quiet that had edges to it. He hadn't lit a fire in 2 days. The pantry was near empty. He had flour, some beans, and the last of the coffee in a jar that looked older than him. Jack wasn't hungry. Hunger had left him weeks ago, the way everything else had. He looked at the corner by the hearth, where Dolly's saddle still leaned. He hadn't the heart to move it. The leather cracked. The straps curled like dried leaves. He remembered the sound it used to make when he mounted her, the crick of the stirrup, the grunt she gave like she was bearing one more burden in a life full of them. There was no letter coming, no visitor on the road. The mailbox out front hadn't held anything but dust in months. He checked it anyway. Habit, maybe hope, though he wouldn't call it that. Hope was for the young and the foolish. The wind picked up, a sudden, angry gust that rattled the shutters and pushed dust under the door. Jack didn't flinch. He just stared at the horizon, where the sky met the land with a line as sharp as a blade. Somewhere beyond it was the past. Somewhere beyond it was everything he'd lost. His breath caught as the pain in his leg sharpened. He closed his eyes and leaned back, letting the heat seep into his skin. Let it burn. Let it remind him he was still here, still breathing, still waiting for something he could not name. The sun stayed high, a fire without mercy, and Jack, alone on his porch, began to think maybe this was the way it would end, not with a bang, not with a goodbye, but with the slow fading of a man no one remembered, under a sky that didn't care. But even then the hawk circled overhead, patient, watching *** at night. The silence was thicker. It crept in slow and settled like dust. Jack would lie on his back, one leg aching with every twitch, and stare at the dark above him, solid, unmoving. There was no comfort in sleep anymore, only memory, and the smell of a hair-sage and smoke came back to him like it was still on the pillow beside him. Her name had been Isadora, though he never called her that. She was Isa to him, half the size of Jack but twice as fierce. She had come up from the south, crossing the border with nothing but a leather bag and the fire in her chest. He met her in a dry goods store, arguing with the owner over the price of flour. Jack said nothing then, just watched. The way her chin lifted, the way her voice didn't flinch. He knew right then she wouldn't belong to anyone, but somehow, she had belonged to him. They married the next spring. It wasn't grand, no preacher, no music, just 2 hands and a promise spoken under a cottonwood tree out back. She planted lavender by the porch and sang in Spanish while she cooked. For a time there was laughter in the house. And music too. A little radio she'd found at a pawn shop, always crackling but never quiet. She'd put her hand on his shoulder when she danced and whispered, "Bailas como un caballo viejo," and Jack would grunt like he didn't understand. Though he did. Then the baby came. Or tried to. She had cried out one morning, doubled over, in the garden, the smell of basil rising all around her. Jack carried her inside and tried to fetch the old truck. It took too long to start. The road into town was rutted and broken, and the doctor was gone that week. Out on some call, 2 towns over. Jack tried to keep her breathing, tried to keep her awake. He read psalms out loud, though neither of them were ever much for church. By dusk, her hand slipped from his. The baby never took a breath. He buried them together. One small coffin, hand-built. One name carved into wood, one cross hammered into the hard ground. After that, the house emptied itself. The music stopped. The lavender withered. Jack stayed. He could have left. There were men who'd offered him good money for the land, said he could buy a place in Albuquerque or up near the mountains. He told them no. He had made a promise. To her, to this land, to the life they had tried to build, so he stayed. Winter came and went. The winds grew harsher. The walls thinned. Sometimes at night he would hear her voice again. Not words, just a sound, like the hush of breath against his ear, or the laugh she gave when he burned the tortillas. He would open his eyes and see only shadows, but he didn't mind. Shadows were better than nothing. He used to be a soldier once, a good one. Folks said he was steady, fair quick with a rifle, but never cruel. He had medals tucked in a drawer, still in the velvet they gave him. But none of it helped when Issa screamed in pain and he couldn't stop it. None of it helped when the light left her eyes, and all he could do was hold her hand and whisper that he was sorry outside. The wind pressed through the cracks in the boards, cold and constant. It had a way of crawling through the seams, brushing past his face like a ghost with unfinished business. The old window by the bed groaned on its hinges, and Jack pulled the blanket tighter over his chest. The clock ticked on, slow and steady, like a heart too stubborn to stop. The land outside hadn't changed, still dry, still wide, still unforgiving. But inside, where memory hung like fog, Jack lived in the folds of time, not moving forward, not letting go, just drifting, held in place by a promise, and the wind that wouldn't leave him alone. The wagon came limping into town at dusk, pulled by a mule that looked half dead and barely willing. Its hooves clopped unevenly over the dirt, and every turn of the wheel let out a groan like an old man's knees giving out. The wagon bed was no more than a plank of splintered wood with a torn canvas flapping in the breeze, and in the back sat a girl, not a woman in the full sense, not a child either, pale as driftwood, thin as a scarecrow, her belly full with child and trembling under her shawl. Jack stood near the feed store, watching from the shade of the porch. He hadn't planned on coming into town that day, but the storm last night had taken out a length of his fence and the nails had run low. Now he wasn't thinking about nails. He wasn't thinking about the fence. He just stared. The driver of the wagon was a woman with a face leathered by sun and bitterness. Her mouth moved fast, sharp as flint, shouting to no one and everyone. She yanked the girl down by the arm and marched her straight toward the center of town, where the crowd always thickened when trouble came around. Jack followed without knowing why. His boots hit the dust in rhythm with the girl's limp. There were maybe a dozen folks gathered, old men in sweat-stained hats, boys too young to know better, and women pretending not to look while they whispered behind fans. The girl was pushed forward like a crate of apples. Her mother, if you could call her that, yelled something about debts, about no good daughters, about needing to eat. She held up her hand and barked a price in dollars to start. No one moved. Not at first. Thought the girl didn't cry. Her eyes scanned the faces, not searching for mercy, just marking the fact that it wasn't there. Her mouth was tight, her hands clenched around the folds of her dress. The baby kicked once. Jack could see it shift beneath the cotton. He felt something rise up in him then. Not anger, not pity, recognition that she had Issa's eyes. Not the color. Issa's had been black as river rock, while this girl's were muddy brown, but the shape, the sorrow, the stubbornness, the part that said, I will not beg. Jack stepped forward. He didn't ask the price again. He didn't argue. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out the old money clip, its silver dulled by time. $8 silver. That was all he had on him. He handed them over without a word. The woman grabbed the coins, counted them quick, and didn't look back. The girl stood still, eyes fixed on the ground. Jack didn't offer his hand, didn't say she'd be safe. He just nodded toward his wagon, and she followed. They rode back without speaking. The sun had started to sink by then, low and red behind the hills. Its light spilled across the land like blood in a basin, soaking into every ridge and valley. The dust from the wheels curled up into the air and caught the light, turning it gold for a second before it vanished. Jack drove the mule slow, partly for her sake, partly because there was no reason to rush. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was too heavy for that. It was the kind of silence that came after something had already broken. Once, on a bend near the dry riverbed, he glanced over. She was staring straight ahead, one hand resting on the swell of her stomach. She didn't look at him, but she didn't look away either. When they reached the ranch, the sun had gone, and the sky was leaking blue into black. Jack didn't speak as he helped her down. She didn't speak as she stepped onto the cracked earth of his yard, and somewhere, behind them, far off in town, a woman laughed with new silver in her pocket, and a baby mule brayed at the dying light. She didn't cry, not even once. Not that first night. Not the next morning. Not when Jack handed her a blanket and pointed toward the barn. She scrubbed the kitchen floor like she meant to erase herself from it. Each stroke of the brush sent small waves of soapy water across the cracked boards, her knees red and raw beneath her skirt. Jack watched from the doorway for a while, then turned away. He didn't ask for her name. She didn't offer it. But a week later, when she was rinsing out clothes by the water trough, she muttered it without looking up. Marisol, that was all she said. He nodded and walked on. She was carrying a child, that much was plain. Her belly was round and taut, the way Esau's had once been before everything had gone wrong. Jack couldn't help but glance at it sometimes, though he tried not to. She was maybe in her 7th month, maybe more. The way she moved told him she was getting close, but Marisol never mentioned the baby. She acted like it was something separate from her, a weight she had accepted without affection. Jack cleared out the old feed room in the barn, built a bed frame from leftover pine, laid down what was left of Ice's mattress and covered it in a wool blanket. He didn't say it was for her, just left the door open and pointed. She didn't thank him, but that night, he heard the barn door creak closed after she went in. Days passed, then a week. The pattern took shape. Jack made breakfast and left it on the table. When he came back from the field or the corral, the plate was clean, and the sink washed. Sometimes she left biscuits for him, sometimes not. He didn't ask for more. They didn't speak, but the silence changed shape. It softened around the edges. One evening, the pain in Jack's leg grew sharp and mean, riding up his thigh like a fire. He tried to make it to the porch, but didn't. The world tilted sideways and he hit the ground hard, dust filling his mouth. His eyes, when he came to, the stars were above him, and a warm cloth pressed against his forehead. Marisol knelt beside him. Her hands were small but strong, steady as they held a chipped enamel cup to his lips. He drank water, cool and clean. She didn't speak, just watched him until his breathing slowed. Then she helped him to his feet, one arm under his ribs. Together they shuffled inside. Jack never said thank you, but he set out a tin of peaches. The next morning, his only can. When he came back that night, the tin was empty and sitting on the windowsill, washed and gleaming in the last light of day. The rains came the day after. Not a storm, not the kind that tears the roof off or sends cattle into a panic. Just a soft, steady drizzle that began in the early morning and carried on through the evening. Jack stood on the porch and watched it fall on the tin roof of the barn, on the thirsty ground, on the sagging fence line. Marisol stood just inside the door, arms crossed over her chest, eyes following the drops as they slid down the glass. He didn't say it, but something in him shifted. Inside the barn, the roof ticked with rain like a lullaby. Marisol sat on the edge of her bed, hands resting on the curve of her belly, and listened. Outside, the land darkened under the weight of water, and somewhere deep in the dust, seeds stirred that hadn't seen light in years. Asterisk, asterisk, the child kicked. She flinched. Then she smiled for the first time. Jack didn't see the smile, but he heard the soft sound of it through the window, barely more than a breath, but something different than silence. He looked up from the porch, where he was mending a broken stirrup, and saw her resting in the barn doorway, one hand on her stomach, the other wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee. The smile vanished the moment she noticed him watching, but it had been there, real, and for a man who'd been surrounded by nothing but silence and ghosts, it was enough. Marisol was close. Her walk had slowed, and her breathing came heavier. By the day, she no longer moved like someone trying to disappear. Jack noticed the way she lingered in the kitchen after supper, the way her fingers brushed against the worn wood of the table as if trying to remember something about being safe. She still didn't talk much, but her quiet had changed. It no longer held sharp edges. Jack started working on a cradle. He went into the old shed behind the coop, found the planks of pine he had stacked there years ago, meant for shelves that never got built. The wood had aged, but not rotted. He sanded it smooth, carved the corners by hand. His fingers ached from the effort, but it didn't matter. He hadn't built anything in a long time. Not since Isa. He didn't tell Marisol what he was making, but he left the shed door open so she could see it from the porch. The fire in the hearth began to burn more regular. Another weak, reluctant kind he used to light out of habit, but a steady, full flame. The kind that heated bone. Jack even cleared out the spare room that had been Isa's sewing space. He didn't say it was for the baby, but he folded a clean quilt across the empty bed. Then, one afternoon, the wagon came back. He saw it before. He heard it, dust rising in the distance, a lazy swirl against the horizon. The same mule, the same sun-baked boards, and behind the reins sat the same woman, her mouth twisted and cruel. She pulled into the yard like it was hers. Didn't wait to be welcomed at Marisol. Froze in the doorway, her eyes locked on the woman. Jack stepped between them. "She's mine," the woman barked. "You paid, but I didn't say forever. You want to keep her, you pay again. Or I tell the sheriff you took her. Man like you, alone out here, who's gonna believe your side?" Jack didn't flinch. He went inside, slow, deliberate. Came back with the rifle. He didn't raise it, not right away, just rested it across his arms like a warning. His leg throbbed, but he stood straight. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than wind in dry grass. "She stays." The woman spat, cursed, called Marisol names that made Jack's blood go cold, but he didn't move. He didn't shout. He just stared, and behind his eyes was something old and unshakable. After a long minute, she turned the mule and left. No more words. That night, Jack lit the fire himself. He sat near it longer than usual, the heat licking at his boots, the shadows dancing across the floor. Marisol sat across from him, silent, her hands folded in her lap. He didn't ask if she was afraid. She didn't say thank you. But when the wood popped and a spark flew up the chimney, he looked across the room and saw her watching the flames, not with fear, but with something else. The fire burned deep into the night, not for warmth, not for light, but for proof that something could still rise from ash and stay burning. Asterisk, asterisk, she screamed into the night, the wind carrying it across the plains, a sound that didn't shatter, didn't break. It stretched and twisted like the sky itself was being pulled apart. Jack knelt beside her, knees buried in hay and dirt, one hand locked in hers, the other gripping the edge of the rusted basin he'd filled from the rain barrel. His breath came in short bursts, not from panic, but from the pain in his leg, now pulsing like it had a heartbeat of its own. The lamp swung on its hook above them, casting long shadows across the barn walls. Outside, the wind clawed at the roof, whistling between boards and stirring the dust. But inside, the world had narrowed to a bed of blankets laid out on the earth. A woman trembling in labor, and a man too stubborn to let her do it alone. She had gone quiet hours ago, only the occasional moan escaping her lips. But now the storm inside her rose again, and she cried out, her hand squeezing his like she meant to crush the bones. Jack leaned close, whispered low, not words of comfort. He didn't have those, just presence, just weight, steady as the land. Beneath them, Marisol's face was slick with sweat, her hair matted against her cheeks, but her eyes were clear, terrified, fierce, focused. Jack had seen that same look in battle, in the last seconds before men crossed lines they never came back from. Asterisk, the baby came slow. There was blood, more than Jack expected, but he didn't flinch. He did what needed doing. He cleared the cord, cleared the airways, held the boy upside down for a second and waited. Then a cry, small, cracked but real. The barn fell still. The wind stilled. Even the old mule in the next stall stopped shifting. Jack wrapped the baby in the towel he had brought from the house, the one with the faded blue stripes. His hands shook. He wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the moment Marisol reached. Without speaking, he placed the bundle in her arms, and she looked down at the child as if trying to memorize something already slipping away. Her lips moved, a whisper in Spanish. Jack didn't catch it, but he didn't ask. He sat back against the wall, his breath coming hard now. He pressed his hand to his chest, right above the tumor buried in his leg and reaching deeper every day. It was a cold kind of hurt, the kind that felt like something final. Still, he smiled. It was not a wide smile, not joyful, but full, real, like the last log on a fire catching flame just before going dark. They stayed that way for a long while, mother, child, Jack. The oil lamp flickered low, and the dark crept in around the edges. Soft and slow. Morning came gray and heavy. Marisol awoke to silence. Not the kind that came before a storm, but the kind that followed something ending. She reached out, half in sleep, expecting the weight of the baby. He was there, sleeping against her chest, warm and breathing. She sat up, listened. No wind, no footfall. Then she saw him. Jack, just outside the barn door, slumped against the frame. His hat had fallen beside him. One hand rested on the dirt. The other was pressed to his thigh, where the fabric was soaked, dark and stiff. She didn't scream. She didn't rush. She wrapped the baby tighter, stood, and walked to him. He wasn't breathing, but his face was peaceful, eyes closed, that same quiet smile on his mouth. The sky outside was pale with early light. The field stretched out in silence, washed clean from the storm. A single leaf skittered across the yard, pushed gently by a breeze that no longer carried pain. For the first time in a long time, the wind didn't howl. It listened. Asterisk, asterisk. Smoke rose from the chimney, curling soft into the pale morning like a slow breath returning to a body long at rest. The sky above the mesas stretched wide and pink, streaked with threads of orange that shimmered across the frost-bitten land. It was spring again, the kind that came late out here, the kind that didn't ask permission, only showed up one day, with light on its shoulders and waited to be noticed. Inside the house, the wood stove crackled, its heat pushing gently through the rooms. Marisol moved through the kitchen barefoot, the hem of her dress brushing the floor. Her hands were rougher now, but steadier. She worked in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because some mornings didn't need words. They just needed presence. Bread rising under a cloth, a tea kettle warming, the hush of something whole. The child stirred in the next room, a boy nearly walking now, full of laughter that still surprised her when it came. He had his father's eyes, not Jack's, but the man she'd known before him, and yet, when he smiled, there was something else there too, something quiet and certain, like the way Jack used to stand with one hand on his belt and the other, cradling a mug, staring at the land as if it spoke a language only he understood. On the mantel, a photograph stood in a frame built from pine, faded now, curled at the edges. Jack stood beside Dolly, his old mare, one arm resting on the saddle horn. He wasn't grinning. Jack never grinned, but there was a trace of a smile, caught in the slant of his mouth, the kind that looked like it might grow if you gave it enough time. She looked at that photo each morning, not as ritual but as a reminder, that men could be both broken and kind, that healing didn't always come with noise. The boy's feet pattered across the wooden floor. He toddled into the kitchen, one hand reaching up toward her knee. She lifted him, held him against her hip. His hair smelled like wind and milk. After breakfast, she opened the door and stepped outside. The air was crisp but gentle. The earth still wore the bruises of winter, but green was beginning to push through brave, stubborn shoots rising between cracks in the soil. The boy squirmed and she let him down. He ran, wobbling, toward the tall grass at the edge of the field, his fingers brushing against the blades as if greeting them. He laughed once, high and bright, then kept running until the grass swallowed him to the waist. Mariswal stood by the porch, arms crossed loosely, eyes following him but not with worry. He knew the land. It would hold him. Overhead, a white crane passed across the sky, wings wide and slow, its flight easy and deliberate. It made no sound. It didn't need to. Some things moved through the world without asking for attention. She watched it glide past the rising sun, its shadow passing over her like a quiet blessing. Behind her, smoke still rose from the chimney. Ahead of her, the boy danced in the grass. The sun pressed down again, but this time, it felt warm.